Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 31st of October, and I really apologize for not uploading over the past 4 days because so much has unfolded over that period of time. Essentially, everything that we've been talking about over the past couple of months really did culminate and consolidate over this 4 day time span. And so I'm going to focus most of my efforts today on the southern Donetsk front, then look at Kurakhivka, Kurakhove, and everything that's beyond those towns. And so I do apologize because I won't be able to look in that much detail into other parts of the front line, like, for instance, Vovchansk, where there are some updates, or Kursk, or, for instance, the Luhansk front, but I will get to them sometime this weekend once I find the time. I really was not focusing at all on the developments here because I was so busy with school, but now I have some time. So we're going to go through this thoroughly, and I want to show you guys the significance of the southern Donetsk front more than just the front line, but more so looking into the future, what is really important about the depth in this region. So I'm going to explain that as the video goes on. Just to begin, I want to show you guys the advances that have occurred over the past 4 days, so it could serve as a pretty good summary for everybody that's been keeping track of the events over here. Look at this, 75 square kilometers of Russian advances, and this is only one portion of the southern Donetsk front. It's actually more than this in total. This is just due to the large-scale efforts of the Russian 29th Combined Arms Army. You have the efforts of the 36th and 57th Motor Rifle Brigades. You also have the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade operating in this region. So those are the main elements involved, along with the 430th Motor Rifle Regiment, plus the 5th Tank Brigade. They also had an involvement and raised their flag. I believe it was in Yasna Poliana. Here you can see the geolocation from October 29th. Russian 5th Tank Brigade has recently become active in this region and is providing a lot of tank support for the armored columns that are pushing through in this region. In terms of armored columns, the Russian forces have been able to use them very liberally here. They were able to use larger concentrations, larger quantities of forces, whether it be BMPs or MTLBs, and usually they do have the sort of turtle, or as the Ukrainians call them, like box perimeter on top of them, but they still do move in unison through large swaths of open fields. And because the Ukrainians are not contesting them, they're, first of all, not receiving as much damage, and they're able to push deeper in and dismount large groups of forces in tree lines, and in some cases actually in villages entirely. So you could see how the village of Shakhtarska was first taken over, and we have all the proof here marked. 40th Naval Infantry Brigade was able to take over Shakhtarska by the 28th of October. The flag was raised over there, and in very similar fashion the next day, by advancing along the paved road connecting Shakhtarska to Yasna Poliana, the village to the north was captured. And again, you're looking at villages that don't have as much destruction when you're looking at the drone footage published by the Russian side, because they have not been at the center of shelling or just house-to-house fighting for any long period of time. And so there's just a very stark contrast to the villages where there actually was drown-out fighting, and it shows you as a reflection that the Ukrainians were not able to resist in these areas. Here, October 31st, this is the Sigma detachment of the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, and also the reconnaissance battalion of this unit. They were able to infiltrate and take over the entirety of Ukrainka, so they raised the flag over here as well. That occurred today. And more generally, you had some Russian efforts that were rebuffed to a certain extent by the Ukrainians. And this is one of the only examples over the past week where there has been some sort of Ukrainian organized response to Russian large-scale attacks in this region. And again, you're looking at a maximum Russian push of 5 kilometers to this part of the gully, and then all the way up to Yasna Poliana, it's an advance with a maximum of 9 kilometers. If we're looking for the, I suppose, most generous number that I could provide for the Russian side when it comes to a northern advance, it will be 1.5 kilometers, all the way from the field in tip west of Vuhledar to the positions south of Trudove, which is just an insane amount when you're thinking about such a small period of time. So it was on October 27th when the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade released footage of FPV strikes that targeted 4 Russian tanks, 1 MTLB, and 1 BTR. That was the first public proof that the unit was moved to defend this region, and it makes a lot of sense because the 128th Brigade, you can see it here on the map, they have spent over a year really on their own, delegated with the responsibility of holding on to the front line west of the Orkiv sector. So they weren't even defending in the Orkhiv sector. They were defending in an area that is even less heated than that in what I guess, if you recall, is Pyatikatki, which is very close to the Dnipro River. So it's a part of the front line that has not seen that much combat, and so it was a way for rest after this unit spent the first year and a half of the war just in some insane conditions, whether it be Bakhmut Solidar or in Kherson. So they've just been through so much, and so they spent the past year really giving it the opportunity to rebuild. And so I believe that it is largely a new unit at this point because a lot of the original stock have either been severely wounded or are killed. And so just a lot of those ranks were filled over the past year. Now it's being reintegrated into high scale fighting after a long period of time where it does not have that experience. So being thrown right into an area that is extremely heated, but it's definitely necessary because now you're going to have supplement of 2,000 more men to help stabilize the front line. And in a second, we'll look at where the Ukrainians are going to try to do that. But for now, just know the unit is present over here. And I believe that, and we're going to look at this in a second as well, which other units can be moved in to help assist with such defensive activities. A new unit that the Ukrainians have that is becoming relatively active around here is the 123rd Mykolaiv Territorial Defense Brigade. They're not new in the sense that like the unit's been around for a while, but recently we've seen them become more active with Ukraine's activities in this area. So specifically, the unit's 48th Assault Battalion conducted a raid into Zolotaniva, and we don't know the date for it. So depending on whether we get more corroboration or footage, I would have to change the map to show a Ukrainian push into the center of this village, because here you have not this video but a separate one. I believe this one, you can see here that the BTR from that unit advanced along the main highway and dismounted infantry in the village, then of course made a turn back. We just don't know when it's dated, but it was definitely from the past month. So that's just interesting to keep in mind that there is now a supplement to the 58th Motorized Brigade, because we know that they were operating almost entirely on their own east of Velika Novosilka. Now they at least have some support from a couple hundred more from the 48th Battalion. And actually, even though the footage showed the Ukrainians penetrating into Zolotaniva, over the past 2 days, Ukrainian sources like Deep State indicate a Russian advance of 2.7 kilometers westwards from Zolotaniva along that same highway, which really is threatening to Velika Novosilka. Looking at Bokhoyevlenko for a second, I want to show you guys that, first of all, the Russians had captured that on the 29th of October. This was due to the 57th Motor Rifle Brigade raising their flag over here. They, of course, took over the local agricultural facilities as well and advanced along a very narrow corridor northwards along the ponds and tree lines without suffering much resistance, and in tandem bombed significantly the positions in Trudove, because, again, after Trudove, you have a direct entrance into Uspenivka, which is the main Ukrainian sort of glue and fabric. Now it is so close to the front line that a lot of these sort of key logistics points and command and control hubs are being moved northwards. A lot of the assets are. And so Uspenivka, over time, begins to lose some of its value. But nonetheless, it is still important as an artery that connects to areas close to the front line, like Ilinka or all these other villages that are along this diagonal chain. And all those villages now are under extreme pressure because you have direct Russian attacks coming in from the east. You have this sort of impending danger from Bokhoyevlenko. Combined together, those two pincers, they make for very threatening attacks towards those positions. So just keep an eye out for this, because now the Russians, they're only about 3.8 kilometers away, and they have 3.2 square kilometers captured in northern Bokhoyevlenko. When it comes to Katerianivka, we know that the Russians fully captured it. I was not able to discuss it in any detail because I didn't upload a video for it. But in total, it's an advance of 3 square kilometers by the Russian side, including the fields west of the village. So on October 28th, you had confirmation of this via a video from the 79th Brigade, and they had a combination of artillery, drones, just small arms fire, anti-tank fire, mines, targeting a large Russian column that was pushing towards Yelizavetivka. The Russian column included 13 armored vehicles with infantry, clearly for the purpose of dismounting in a large scale, 4 tanks for support, a BMP-T Terminator, and 4 motorcycles. In total, the 79th claims they were able to destroy 9 armored vehicles, 2 tanks, the BMP-T Terminator, and then also damaged an additional 2 armored vehicles. They claim they were able to kill 25 Russian soldiers in the assault and wounded 23. And so, again, I've continued repeating this from the 79th Brigade, but they have very similar numbers for the amount of Russians killed and wounded in these column assaults. It's usually around the 20 mark for both killed and wounded. And I find that very interesting that it's very consistent numbers regardless of the specific amount of vehicles being used. It's just something that I've seen continue to pop up. But for a lot of the claims they have, they are backed up by the footage that I have linked on my map. Not entirely. You can't expect them to show every single individual loss, but you can see that once certain columns are picked off by mines that are placed over here or by mobile squads that are targeting them with RPGs or ATGMs, and you have FPVs, of course, disabling vehicles. Then the troops dismount in the hinterlands in these open areas. They try to seek cover in tree lines that may have lost some foliage. And then that's when you have the drones dropping grenades or FPVs picking them off. And there is proof of that shown. So it's not completely unrealistic. Like, I couldn't believe those numbers. Here you have a video from October 27th. The Ukrainians targeting 4 Russian armored vehicles en route to Andriivka. So definitely Russian pressure coming in from 2 axes over here. One from the eastern highway, one from the south. And now part of the village is a gray zone. I know that as early as 4 days ago, actually, the Russians, some Russian sources claimed that the eastern portion of the village was under their control, but I just haven't seen anything to substantiate it ever since. So I'm going to wait for additional proof. It's very important for the Ukrainians to drag their feet in these regions because continued losses in this area, continued losses of villages that are intrinsically linked together, like Elizavietivka and Elinka, it will put everything else in danger, and that eventually leads to the fall of the entire chain of villages. That fall would give the Russians really, really good access to this paved route and more generally fields that are directly south of Kurakhove. And it would really allow the Russians to tighten the noose even further on the Ukrainians that are now retreating and coalescing around Kurakhove as a central defense mechanism. And it would be really only 8 kilometers between Uspenivka and the Kurakhove reservoir. So very, very important for the Ukrainians to maintain some sort of depth in this region by maintaining control of populated areas and the accompanying trenches. You do actually have Ukrainian defenses that were built across the river here, and the Ukrainians, they will be trying to make use of them to drag out the fighting. So here you have the Sukhyali River, that's the name of this river, and it is a natural barrier. The Ukrainians, they have to rely a lot on natural barriers in this region because they don't have the best well-developed trenches in this particular area. So this includes using the river valleys for defensive purposes. Same thing would go for the area to the west with the Mokriali River. This region also has to be utilized as a sort of natural defense obstacle to prevent the Russians from pushing westwards, for instance. If you look a bit northwards, you have a few other of these sort of natural defense barriers, including the Vavcha River along Andriivka. But you see the issue is everything in between those rivers that I just mentioned is included in this really wide encompassing rectangle. This wide encompassing rectangle, it's a bit dishonest because in my map with the KML files that I imported with the trenches, they're not up to date completely. There are actually 2 lines of anti-tank ditches that the Ukrainians built, and I'll show you where they end, and it's very interesting. They sort of start over here, they go north of Rozdolne, and they sort of simmer out before Yasna Poliane. And then there's another one that does basically the same thing in unison. It's so weird that the Ukrainians began large-scale building and construction of not just trenches and Dragon Seed, but also full-on anti-tank ditches, really, really wide ones. And then they stop before reaching the area that is most critical for the present defense, which would be Yasna Poliana. It's as if they were building layer after layer directly north of Velika Novosilka, but did not have the same level of attentiveness to the region just to the east, which, as you can see on my map and with the fortifications that I've imported, you do have this sort of makeshift line that was built that runs north of Novoukrayinka and then connects to Uspenivka, but it is very tenuous and easy to break through. And then after that point, you have nothing left directly northwards all the way until Andriivka itself. You have to actually cross over the Vavcha River into Andriivka, the northern outskirts, to actually reach a solid defense line. And of course, in between, you have tree lines and there may be dugouts there, but it's not anything at scale, not anything that is organized for a long period of prolonged defense. So that is extremely worrying for the Ukrainian side. The Russians here, if you're measuring it out, they're only about 14 kilometers away from Andriivka. They're already launching significant fab strikes onto Rozliv. And if you're looking at it, there's just one paved road, one route that connects between the current line of contact and Rozliv. It's only about 8.5 kilometers away. And getting control over this village, again, it would serve as a perfect springboard to begin assaults and harassment onto the southern outskirts and suburbs. All these villages south of Andriivka would be at play. And then you're also looking at potentially cutting off huge chunks of highways, horizontal highways that go eastwards into Kurakhove, go westwards towards these various villages on the Mokriali River, and then even Dnipro Oblast. All in all, you have this really important rear region, which the Ukrainians did not expect to be at the nexus of fighting. But again, the Russians, they sensed an opportunity, they sensed the weak points, and the Ukrainians really built very dense defenses everywhere in this area, except for the region north of Vuhledar itself. And now the Russians are taking advantage of that. When it comes to Andriivka, you could see how the Russians are positioning themselves in a way to continue advancing northwards, taking control of key ridges that are located in the open areas where the arrows are located, in addition to continuing to push eastwards from Selidove. That's why Selidove was taken in the first place. Why there was such a particular emphasis on it, because continued advances from Selidove and further westwards provides the Russians with an access to attack the northern flank of Andriivka and cut off the road between Andriivka to Dobropilya. Dobropilya is over here, a bit to the north. I want to show you guys it all the way over here. So definitely that's a part of the Russian thinking. This two-pronged attack, one time coming from the south, the other coming from the east. It's not anything too complicated. It just naturally sort of stands out when you're looking at the map. And there's maximalist Russian potential advances, which would include those two pincers converging along Andriivka itself. The more minimalist one would be those pincers converging around the western outskirts of Kurakhove in order to cut off Kurakhove and squeeze the Ukrainians out of this region. Either way, this entire horizontal line, which includes Andriivka, which is so critical for the southern Donetsk Ukrainian defense apparatus and logistics and artillery bases, everything that is important for the functioning of a sort of military organism, all of that would be undermined by continued Russian advances here, which is emboldened by a lack of depth and a lack of proper reinforcements being sent in. Besides the 128th Brigade, there has to be additional ones sent in. And from Velika Novosilka, the chances are very slim because already the garrison here is pretty small. So we're going to have to look at reinforcements coming in from Kherson. We'll look at the Marine Brigades in a second. Kharkiv sector, maybe. Huliapoli. Again, numbers there are pretty small, but there are a few access brigades that are not engaged currently in that much active fighting. So really do keep an eye out for that. Going a bit northwards, I want to show you guys what's going on directly to the east of Kurakhove here. So the Russians are continuing to send in large-scale armored assaults along the same narrow corridor because now they sense the ability to reach a boiling point, a point at which they will actually be able to cross past the outskirts and begin to infiltrate into the city itself. And this region over here, you could see based on geolocations, is where that's being focused. So the 46th Brigade, they released footage on October 28th of their FEV strikes onto the Russian column pushing to Kurakhove. But actually on October 29th, this is more interesting, you had 5 Russian BMPs and 2 tanks attack in the early morning. So all those vehicles that attacked in the morning, they came from the energetic agricultural community west of Maksimilianivka. The goal is to bypass this trench system over here, this fortress, and actually dismount troops in the residential blocks themselves. So this included 5 BMPs, 2 tanks, and then within 15 minutes, 4 of those BMPs and 2 of those tanks, according to the 46th Brigade, were either damaged or destroyed by artillery because, again, the Ukrainians really have bulked up on our artillery stockpiles in this specific area. Also FPV strikes and mines that were laid across the fields. Then also the 1 BMP that was not scathed by any of this dismounted troops. And those troops, they were able to spread out and allow the Russians to get some additional control that you can see marked in yellow. And then those ones, as we've talked about before, with dismounts, were targeted by drones that dropped grenades onto them. And just as a quick sidebar about the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, because I do just want to mention this, the commander of the brigade, Dmitro Lisiuk, that's his name, he was actually placed under suspension in November of last year by Zelensky because there was that incident in Zaporozhye Oblast where they were receiving the unit. They got these award ceremony events going on in a city that was pretty close to the front line. It was targeted in a Russian strike, and 19 soldiers were killed, including a lot of high ranking officers. So, of course, they held the commander liable for that, investigated him. But now, based on new photos that were coming out of Lisiuk, he actually appears to be once again reinstated as commander. He was unsuspended, and now he's once again conducting the operations. So, I guess there could be a debate as to why or whether that's a good idea because of the experience or potentially him having a bad track record will be scrutinized. But in any case, let's look northwards at what's going on with Kurakhivka and Hirnik and further west because this is really important to look at in detail. So again, the main efforts by the Russian side here are coming from DPR units like the 110th Motor Rifle Brigade, which has now crossed over the river, has some sort of presence in Hirnik and to the south, in addition to the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, which came in from the north, took over much of Kurakhivka, and perhaps by now all of it. I just have to see what's going on with the mapping updates by both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, but it really is only a matter of time. As you know, here you can see October 31st, the 114th Brigade raised a flag in the center of Kurakhivka. To the south, you can see actually the Russians getting control over the rest of Alexandropil, which is 3.7 square kilometers. In terms of the advance on the western bank of the Vovcha River, it amounts to, let's see, this is 17.5 square kilometers, so it is a large consolidation and wide-scale Ukrainian retreats. And what this means is that Hirnik, which again definitely did suffer a lot of damage to the northern section of the town, a lot of it is still not that damaged, which means that it is the perfect breeding ground for additional Russian pushes. You have probably columns that could organize around here, troops that are going to be stationed in barracks in those apartment buildings in their basements for long periods of time. It's one of the best things that can happen to an invading force when they capture a large scale city that it's not touched, and then they can use that as a base for continued advances. Now, when we're looking at the culmination of Russian advances, it's important to focus on Vovchenka and the nearby mines because these terracons here are just completely massive and they provide a massive point of domination for the Russian side if they get control over them. So getting control, for instance, over this mine over here, that would be enough to completely overlook everything, this entire sort of corridor that's still bulging out south of Novoselyadivka. It amounts to, let's see, 6 kilometers from north to south. That entire area that is relatively open in fields would be overlooked by the Russian side, and they could fire upon it in accordance. So definitely that's an issue for the retreating forces over here because they're not going to be putting up an efforts to hold on to those mines. They're really only focusing on avoiding really large encirclements or salients from being formed. It's also a matter of preserving manpower because of the high number of losses that were occurring while Hirnik was, in the throes of a battle. When it comes to Novoselyadivka, for instance, the Russian forces are pushing deeper over here, 1.6 square kilometer advance. Definitely there is Russian activity in this village, and a lot of the Russian operations here, they're occurring in a way wherein the Russians advance through very narrow routes, and they don't receive as much resistance, so they're able to do so. They're able to then push for depth, and after that, consolidate all the advances. So usually this is done through rail lines. So for instance, the windbreaks coming from Sukornia, that serves as a perfect sort of organizing point for these attacks coming into Kremina Balka. And there's actually unconfirmed reports of the Russians operating in Voznesenka, so I have to keep an eye out for that. But yeah, more generally, the Russians definitely are not gonna relieve the pressure that they are currently putting on, whether it come from the east, where now the Russians are just working on solidifying, but especially from the north. From the north, there's going to be a lot of sustained pressure because you do still have hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers located in this very, very dense, large open field region with a few villages like Sapianivka, Ilinka, Beretsky, but it's simply an area that is too concentrated and too cut off to be held onto for any long period of time. Also, horrible elevation, so close to this reservoir. So what this means is that you have elements of the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade, 119th Territorial Defense Brigade, 110th Mechanized Brigade. This unit was recently moved in, I would say, over the past 1-2 weeks from the northern part of the front line. I would refer to this as the area northeast of Pokrovsk, and clearly that area is of less importance for the Russian side. So they've been moved here to act as sort of vanguard to block the path while the rest of the units are able to withdraw effectively. So you do also have the Presidential Brigade. So they have several battalions that are operating around here. 21st Special Purpose Battalion, that's a relatively well-known one. Here you have elements of the 59th Brigade. That includes the 108th Battalion, and there was a few other ones that are mentioned on my map over here. So all of those units that I mentioned, those are the ones that made the efforts in Hrynik possible for as long as it unfolded. And then those are the ones that decided to withdraw, and I'd say that largely it was spontaneous, but of course there's going to be claims from the Ukrainian high command that they were the ones that gave orders for such withdrawals. But just on a pure human level and pure squad level, seeing all the dynamics unfold, it was just understandable for the Ukrainian side to withdraw. But it's not over, because you do still have the salient over here that the Russians are going to work on closing off, while the Ukrainians try to stabilize along that line. And the reason for that would be to just give some breathing space for Andriivka, its eastern suburbs, which would be, in the case of the current line of contact, about 13 kilometers away. But then you're looking at the fall of the salient, and the salient itself, if you're to measure from its western tip, it's only about like 9.5 kilometers away. So that would already be within the range, of course, of short range shelling. So that is very concerning for the Ukrainian garrison in Andriivka. So keep an eye out for that. Looking a bit to the north at Novodmitrivka, here you have an advance amounting to 7.25 square kilometers by the Russian side. I want to see where the video was located. It's here in the center. So this video is from the 35th Marine Brigade. It's of FPV strikes onto individual Russian soldiers that were able to dismount as the vehicle came in from the highway. I find this very interesting because 35th Marine Brigade, as you may know, they've been operating for over a year now in Kherson with the 3 other Marine Brigades. So there were 4 in total. Of course, one of them, I think the 36th is the one that is heavily involved with what's going on in Kursk. 38th will get to 35th, as you can see on my map over here. It's a unit that was moved in after just months of pointless assaults in the Krinky region. So now they're operating here, and they're going to be assigned some defensive roles. And it's a broader part of the Ukrainians understanding the needs for stabilization, because right now you're looking at a front line that is, of course, very conducive for flexible Russian advances from village to village. But it gets worse at some point, because you do have this vertical line, which is not completely finished from Pushkinets all the way to Petropavlivka. It's like a 12-kilometer long sort of trench line, but it's not completely finished. That means that there were gaps over here, and even if there weren't gaps, just one line. After that point, you have one of the largest open areas that I've ever seen that could be potentially part of the sort of conflict, within the guise of the conflict. So I'm going to show it to you guys over here with the shape, and this is just insane because it's a completely large area with not many defenses built, although definitely there could have been. I don't understand whether it's just an issue with the timing of the mapping over here of the trenches, or if the Ukrainians actually did not begin large-scale building over here last year, and by the end of 2023, or even by mid-2024, when there were already discussions in the Ukrainian side of building up these sort of layers of defenses between Donetsk and Dnipro Oblast. And Dnipro, you can't really see it on the map, but it's marked over here. So for the Ukrainians, it really is of the utmost importance not to allow the Russians to take advantage of this area, because not only would that put Andriivka and surrounding villages in danger, it would give the Russians a route to undermine the Ukrainians in Dnipro itself, including with key logistics hubs like Novopavlivka looking northwards. It would be an opportunity to put pressure onto Pokrovsk from not just the south, but also from the west. And more generally, if you're looking at the Pokrovsk region, which Pokrovsk is on just a massive height, absolutely massive, that same ridge leads directly to Dobropilia. And Dobropilia is another city, I'd say, if you were to take out Pokrovsk and Alexandriivka, then you really are left with Dobropilia to be your immediate conduit between the rear and the front line. and you can see how the roads connect to it, how the elevation connects to it. So definitely this would be a very, very long-term endeavor, but it is something the Russians, I believe, are keeping in the back of their mind as a sort of grand strategy long-term for how to conquer large sections of the Donbass. But again, a lot of it is due to the Ukrainian planning of defenses and mismanagement of timescales. And then it creates issues like this where the Russians are able to pounce on that and take over large swaths of territory before any stabilization measures are even possible. When it comes to Selidove, here you can see on the map the large-scale Russian consolidation occurring in the western part of the city. More and more videos beginning to trickle out of Russian troops walking across those streets, and now actually the first ones coming out of the Ukrainians targeting them, because you do have a Ukrainian attempted regrouping. So you have the Ukrainians moving in the Peaky Blinders, good show by the way, UAV units. So they're now operating around here before, I believe, previously having attacks in the Lipsy axis. So they're a part of the main intelligence directorate for the Ukrainian side. They just conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers walking towards Vishneve. Other videos that you can see on my map include here Russian soldiers walking through western Selidove. This video is of the flag raising in Vishneve, confirming the Russians are in full control of that hamlet. Here is from October 31st, a video from the 2nd Battalion of the 15th National Guard Brigade of continued FPV strikes onto agricultural facilities, apartments, houses, fields, where Russians were operating as they continued to clear out the remaining outskirts. Here's the Puma group. It's just this FPV units, I believe, and they just dropped grenades onto Russian soldiers that were grouped in western Selidove. So now you can see proof of the Russians beginning to build up with forces as they are not reducing the intensity of attacks. They do still have the operational capacity to continue advancing along these specific routes and attack from village to village in long, really important battles. What else is there over here? There was an interesting video from the 68th Brigade that I want to show you guys. So this one is of the 68th, and they had grenades dropped onto Russian soldiers entering northern Selidove, because again, this was from October 28th, a couple of days ago, as a part of the initial cleansing operation to ensure that there were no more Ukrainian remnants in Quarter 11 or in any of the other high-rises in the city. Selidove is so important because you have these absolutely gargantuan structures that are so difficult to take down, and then you have basements under them that are great points for FPV crews to congregate around and for troops to sleep in. And then it's just very good for large-scale assaults to conceal vehicles there and equipment, and troops will stay there overnight and then use it as a launch point to begin deeper assault efforts into the rest of Donetsk. So that is just very, very important to keep in mind about Selidove moving forward. Looking a bit to the north, I want to show you guys this interesting advance that occurred just to the northeast of Mykolaiivka. So this advance, if we're looking at the yellow, amounts to 0.9 square kilometers. This video is from the 38th Marine Brigade. So now I have 3 brigades from the Marine Corps that are active, and then you have an additional regiment, which is also operating within this part of the front line. Birds Magyar Regiment, of course. So 38th Marine Brigade, they conducted, of course, grenade drops onto Russian soldiers that were either on foot or dismounted from their vehicles, and also FPV strikes onto those Russian dismounts. This occurred west of Andriivka along this particular highway. Very, very important highway that connects to Mirnorod if you're looking at it. And that's a part of why the Russians are even operating around here. They want to get direct access through this road, or they want to cut off the Ukrainian seamless movement between Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, which right now are sort of in a stabilized situation, and the Ukrainian remnants in northwestern Andriivka. It's actually really interesting because Ukrainian officials are now saying that at some point all the entrances and all the exits will be closed on the perimeter of Pokrovsk, meaning that if you get out, they're not going to be let in, and vice versa. So that's just a sort of application, a way to force more people out so they leave already. Being done for multiple reasons. First of all, because the battle is getting closer and closer to the Pokrovsk region, but I've also reiterated why I believe that head-on assaults are not fruitful. They won't yield the Russian objectives within a realistic time frame. There's better ways to go about attacking the city without as high of losses. And that's why I think the Russians pounced upon the opportunity further south with the southern Donetsk region. And if that could continue culminating and blossoming without the Russians being able to put stabilization measures, then definitely that's the best area to be pouring in resources. But now we do have an indication of a marginal Russian advance here that will put a bit more pressure onto Horodivka. 38th Brigade, they, of course, are another 2,000 men that will serve in defensive capacities. Finally, Novotoretsk. Here you have, let's see which one actually matches. This is the 14th National Guard Brigade, a Ukrainian unit. They conducted an FPV strike onto a Russian BMP after it ran over a mine, so received 2 layers of damage. Here you can see that the Russians basically advanced along this line of gullies, made it all the way to the paved roads over here, and Novotoretsk, at least on Google Maps, does appear to be a hamlet with very, very little population density. So this is interesting because it means that the Russian forces have a direct route along the Torets River, which will put pressure onto Horodivka from the north, give the opportunity to cross over, because that's something I'm very interested on seeing how that would unfold. And then that has, of course, implications for the Ukrainians that are currently defending tooth and nail in the corridor between the line of contact and the highway over here, the highway that I believe leads to Andriivka. It's almost 5 kilometers wide, and you do have really large ridges in this hinterlands region, which make it very difficult for individual columns or troops to overrun. And again, that's why I continue going back to southern Donetsk, because those regions, they actually did have conducive ridges and heights to advance through, and then also overlook valleys. They also had, this opportunity with the lack of trenches, the lack of sufficient reinforcements being moved in. So basically, all the stars aligned for a sort of Russian advance in those regions, and it applies to certain degrees and could apply regardless, but with just higher losses in other areas of the front line, but not to the degree that we saw and are continuing to see occur in southern Donetsk, which I'm really focusing much of the video on, and hopefully I can actually go into more detail because there's a lot I want to discuss about the unfolding situation over here. But just as a final remark, I do want to show you guys some interesting stories from the Ukrainian order of the battle. So here you have the 88th Mechanized Brigade and the 13th Jaeger Brigade. 2 units that were formed supposedly in February of 2023, integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine. Allotted the correct amount of forces and trained on the border with Belarus in specialized drills. So apparently they were mentioned once in an official capacity, these 2 units. But ever since, there's not been any trace of the units operating anywhere, not any clear photos of the troops within the units. So there was always this underlying suspicion that the units weren't real, but militaryland.net actually was able to write a story, and the Ukrainian general staff confirmed that neither of these units, or specifically the 88th unit, is not present. They didn't say anything about the 13th Brigade, but apparently, according to militaryland.net, it's rather likely that neither one of these units is actually one that's actually exists in reality, that corresponds to have a force of 2,000 men with mechanized assets, or depending on it, Jaeger assets, simply not receiving that. I believe that a very likely scenario would be that they took the name of a company or platoon and then just refer to it this way, and then the number and the identity of the unit stuck on. But it could just be a misunderstanding in that regard. It could also be psychological warfare to sort of confuse the Russian sources about where movement is occurring. That is certainly possible. But because we don't have any proof, including a direct rebuke by the Ukrainian military of these units existing, that is why I'm going to delete these units from my map. You could see it occur in real time. But I replaced them with the 160th Mechanized Brigade. You could see them on my map over here in the uncategorized category. This is a unit that is the first of the 160 series, because it's going to go all the way up to 169, and I don't know if all of them will be mechanized or if some will be motorized or infantry, but this one at least is mechanized, talking about the utilization of armored vehicles that come from NATO countries. That's going to be a big part of manning all of these 140 to 160 style units, so definitely keep that in mind. And just wait for the process of recruitment and formation to be in full swing before you see me move this around on the map. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.